Perfect. All right. So now we got some people coming in here. Perfect. So very welcome to this webinar today. We are going to speak about a lot about cost today for you who have not yet figured out what webinar is about. If you haven't figured it out. So we're going to talk about fixed fee structures versus variable cost structures. Basically, when you're pursuing a surrogacy journey, what does that mean in terms of financial models? And what does that mean in terms of potential pitfalls, but also pros and cons? So just going to give people a minute or two to get in here. If you are watching this as the recording, also feel free to reach out to us. We'll give you information at the end. But if you are here, you can actually ask questions throughout the webinar via a Q&A button. We'll do some Q&A at the end if there are any questions after the presentation. But if you do have any questions while we're doing that, please feel free to just kind of shoot them in there until we get to the end. Totally fine. We will get to them at the end. There should be a button on your screen somewhere, depending on, if you are on your iPad, iPhone, all these options these days. So feel free to do so. We're just going to give it another minute to see if there's anybody else struggling with their Zoom, etc. here as well. So just bear with us. We'll definitely end on time. We got about 30 minutes of presentation, more or less, and then we'll do some questions. As long as you have them, we'll keep answering them within reason, of course, but we'll do our best to give you as much time as we can for that. Perfect. So for you who just joined, just told people here that you can do a Q&A. There's a button for that, so feel free to add on questions while we go through this presentation. Perfect. And I see more and more of you coming in here. So let's get started, kind of a soft start. And if anybody joins after, they can just do that. All right. So also my little portrait there, you can move that around on your screen. Sometimes it gets in a very weird place in the presentation. Just like take your finger or your little mouse and move it around. You should be able to do that so you don't miss any important information. All right, so we are here today with myself, obviously. I'm the international manager here at Hatch and PFCLA, and I'm also a two-time father, more importantly, through surrogacy myself and egg donation, for those looking into that as well. Very fun and tiring, as you can imagine. Everybody that has kids maybe already, but still looking into surrogacy knows this, and all of you others will hopefully live through that soon. We also have Greg with us. Greg, do you mind doing like a short introduction?
No. Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Wiles. I'm the president and CFO of Hatch Egg Donation Surrogacy and our partner clinic, Pacific Fertility Center, Los Angeles. My husband, Zach, and I have a 13-month-old daughter via surrogacy, and we're currently working with our same surrogate on baby number 2. So we're in the middle of that process.
Yeah. Awesome. So Greg will do a lot of the talking today from the financial point of view. He also wrote a great article, which this information is based off of on our Hatch blog about expenses and costs in gestational surrogacy. So this is very summarized, but if you're interested, that's a great article, long and detailed, which you need at this stage, researching into surrogacy. So go ahead and look at that at the blog. If somebody wants that article, just shoot me an email. My information will be at the end, or Greg, of course, and just share that with you as well. But let's look into this. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Hatch and PFCLA very briefly, because we have to focus on expenses, right? Which we are all here for. So I'm just going to shortly tell you about Hatch and PFCLA. Then Greg is going to take over and speak about expenses in gestational surrogacy. We're going to look at fixed and base costs, basically what you can expect in any journey. Also some standard costs that might be variable, but also always in kind of occurrence. Some unexpected costs, which are obviously very important. A lot of intended parents asking questions on, what can I expect as far as, non-transparent or hidden costs is used a lot. So those are kind of the unexpected costs, and also other variable costs to keep in mind. Then we'll do a bit of a summary of all those journey costs based on all of those different kind of subcategories. And we'll discuss a little bit of our pros and cons with 2 different models that you can kind of pursue when you look at surrogacy in the US. You can do something called a pay-as-you-go model, or something we call a fixed fee structure. So we'll talk about that a bit and talk through like the pros and cons of doing those. I have experience of actually both of those. My first journey was a pay-as-you-go journey. The second one, a fixed fee structure. So there's definitely a lot of considerations into choosing the right program for you, depending on what you're looking for, what kind of transparency, but also risk averseness that you have going into this journey. And then we'll do some Q&A, but feel free to shoot in the questions as we go through this. There's a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. So, all right, so really briefly, just telling you about Hatch and PFCLA for you who do not know us yet very well. I'm sure you have some information given that you're here today. Hatch and PFCLA jointly has over 60 years of experience doing third-party assisted reproduction, etc. Hatch has been around for 33 years. That's our surrogacy and egg donation agency, where we focus on the non-medical aspects of donor and surrogates, of course, but also the legal parts with amazing partners. Insurance, especially for international intended parents, is important to consider newborn insurance, but also insurance overall for surrogates and donors, and all that coordination that it takes to go through this amazing, albeit sometimes stressful journey here, just making sure everything runs smoothly. And just like Greg mentioned, we have an amazing clinic, Pacific Fertility Center, Los Angeles, which is our own in-house clinic, which is great, where we obviously do everything medical. And we do a couple of amazing things here. It's not that common to have this combination when it comes to kind of the coordination with one team, doing that as seamlessly as possible to take that stress off intended parents to a certain degree is something we focused on with the team that knows each other from the start. But also having financial plans that are very transparent, which is very important for us. So we'll talk about that at the end. But Hatch does fixed fee structures, and we do that for a reason. We want to be able to be very transparent and also be able to tell intended parents, what are you going to pay from day one until the last day? How does that payments timeline look? So you can plan accordingly, because this is quite unromantic sometimes, unfortunately. It's all about budgets and sheets and making sure you can pay through the journey. And then we also have our own clinic, like we mentioned, which is great. So some of the things we can do with that, for example, is medical records review before accepting our surrogates, pre-screenings. Also, uterus lining check is something we recently implemented as the only agency in the US, given that we have our own clinic that should order that for our surrogate applicants. So a lot of that, those things can be done a bit sooner, so we can discuss that as well in the future. But that's a little bit about Hatch and PFCLA and how we work together to kind of maximize the success and also enjoyability of the journey. The child is the end goal, but having a great journey that you enjoy is also very important, of course. All right, Greg, you're up. Take it away. You have loads of time to take us through these expenses in gestational surrogacy.
Sounds good. So just as a quick background, when I joined the agency a little over 5 years ago, I had about a dozen friends go through the surrogacy process. And, a lot of them, I kind of asked all of them how it went for them, right? What the pros and cons were, the good and the bad. And cost was one of probably the most complained about thing. And the things about cost that were sort of irksome to people were it felt like surrogacy was just a series of never-ending list of expenses, that there was always something around the corner that you had to pay more for. That was one complaint. The second complaint was when things didn't go well, it got really expensive. And you have to keep in mind that surrogacy is a very biological process, and despite all the best efforts of the doctors and the nurses and the agency staff involved, there will be unexpected things that happen. There will be miscarriages, there'll be multiple transfers. In very rare cases, there'll be stillbirths, very tragic events, and all those things come with additional costs. And we're going to walk through all of that, but those are just overriding themes in surrogacy that you have to be prepared for before you enter to this journey. And that kind of all goes to the point of it's very difficult to tell you how much surrogacy is going to cost up front. And this has been that way for the 30 years that surrogacy has existed commercially in the United States. There are dozens of agencies in the United States, and all of them have different types of pricing and different ways of framing the pricing. So it does get very difficult to compare how much something costs at one agency and another. And on top of that, some agencies have legal in-house, or they have a clinic in-house like we do. They have egg donation, sometimes in-house and out-of-house. And so, places will offer discounts for doing multiple pieces of the journey with them, and that adds to the complexity of comparison. So, it's very complicated, right? Which is why we're having this webinar, which is why you need to take the time to both understand it and also talk to agencies and truly understand this. That all being said, though, there are really two different kind of baseline models of how agencies will price out a surrogacy journey. And as I've been mentioned earlier, they're really the two of pay-as-you-go, which is pay-as-you-go is what it sounds like, is that you will incur costs as they arise during the journey. That doesn't mean that you won't have to put up that money up front, and you will, what's called an escrow account, the estimated amount of those. But if major things go wrong, you'll have to continue to pay to continue your journey. Other agencies generally have what's called a fixed fee structure. And again, it sounds like it's similar. Various agencies include different things in that fixed fee. But the idea behind fixed fee is that you do know what it costs up front, and there are generally fewer additional charges on top of that fixed fee model, and that usually they will cover you in case something does go wrong. And we'll talk through that a little bit here in a second, but that's really the two main types of pricing schemes that exist in the surrogacy market in the United States. Again, there are pros and cons. There are benefits to both, and we'll walk through those. And it really comes down generally to the protection versus the cost, because in fixed fee structures, you're basically buying an insurance policy. So we're going to walk through today the types of costs that arise. We'll take them one by one, generally in a surrogacy journey. And then after that, we'll talk about how the two types of structures generally deal with those types of costs.
Sounds good.
So let's talk about the fixed costs. And fixed is not like a strict word, but generally these are what are fixed at the beginning of the journey. And by the beginning of the journey, I mean when you meet your surrogate and you match with your surrogate, you will then find out most of these things. But the first thing you'll find out about is how much you're paying your agency, right? When you sign up with an agency, they're going to give you their agency fee, the price that they are having you pay them to usually both find a surrogate for you and manage the journey. Now, some agencies will only do matching. Some agencies will only do case management, like project management of your journey, but most of them tend to do both of these functions. And they will require you to put money down. Most agencies require a pretty hefty deposit to get on their match list to match you. And there'll be subsequent payments, at match or when the pregnancy begins, or even at delivery that agencies will levy. But they all add up in the beginning, and you'll sign a contract saying, this is what I'm going to pay my agency. Then once you meet your surrogate, you're going to find out what her base compensation is. So this is the amount of money that you are going to pay to the surrogate as recompense of her pain, suffering, time spent not doing her normal life, so that she can deliver a child for you. The agency usually sets the compensation. Sometimes some agencies allow the surrogates to set their own compensation. And the way the payments work is you put the money into an escrow account, and then according to a schedule, usually 1/9 across the pregnancy, right? Every month of the pregnancy, it's paid out to her as she achieves certain milestones. And then, of course, at birth, she gets the final payment, or shortly after birth. The amount of money paid to her can vary geographically. Generally, surrogates that live in California earn more money because of the cost of living and demand for California surrogates. But usually you'll know about this in advance when you sign up with the agency. We see that usually vary between about $40,000 and $50,000 on the base side, although some agencies do have higher compensation. Again, this is usually for a first-time surrogate. We'll talk about experienced surrogates here later on in the conversation. On top of their base compensation, surrogates also get allowances. Allowances are either reimbursements for direct expenses incurred, or more simply, and this is the way most agencies do it, they're just cash compensation meant to compensate them for costs incurred. These are things like childcare, housekeeping, maternity clothes, and other things that she needs to incur on your behalf to carry the child and to take time out of her daily life to do so, and go to appointments and checkups and those sorts of things. The agency will set these out in advance. You'll know about them in the cost estimate or the cost sheet that the agency will present to you when they present the surrogate. So you'll know what they cost. But if, for example, you have to restart a pregnancy, let's say there's a miscarriage a third of the way through, and some of these have already been paid out to her 1/9 during the pregnancy, you'll have to incur more of these because she does get these for every month. Couple more. Usually on top of those allowances, the surrogate will get compensation for going through an IVF transfer cycle of your embryos. Typically, the agency split these into two pieces. One is for the actual embryo transfer itself, but another piece will actually be for going through a medicated cycle. Sometimes some doctors will have your surrogate do what's called a mock cycle, which is basically a transfer cycle, 3 weeks of meds that mimics a transfer just to check and make sure everything looks good before they do the real transfer. And so the medications part is meant to compensate her for that. And then the transfer fee is obviously for the embryo transfer. So that, and it's usually a fixed amount also like the allowances for every transfer. And then another fixed cost relates to putting that money into that account we talked about earlier. An escrow company effectively manages the funds. Now, for those of you that have been doing some Googling on surrogacy, you probably have heard about Seam, a company in Texas that stole other people's money as an escrow account. That's why it's really important to ask your agency which escrow company they're working with. Historically, these were connected to law firms because, again, law firms 30 years ago are really like the center of the surrogacy world. That's why a lot of law firms started surrogacy agencies. And usually the law firm would hold the escrow account for the parents on behalf of the surrogate. Lately now, we're seeing the industry consolidate around a couple of independent escrow companies who have much larger scale, that are part of larger companies, and where parents can trust that their funds are held in a safe place. C-Trust is our preferred, and it is actually consolidating most of the market right now. And so we work with them, but make sure you really ask about that. Those companies charge a fee to do the escrow, which means that they will look at the contract and pay out the amounts to the surrogate throughout the pregnancy, including reimbursements, so that you can have the peace of mind that they're doing all that work for you. That ranges between like $1,500 and $2,500. All right, so those are the base costs. So those ranges, when you add them all up, can be as little as 80,000, but tend to average around 100,000 US dollars for just the things you know about in advance.
Yeah.
But now we're going to talk about the variable costs. These are things where you don't know what they're going to be when you sign up, and you may not even know what they're going to be when you match with your surrogate. There are going to be estimates provided, but when it all shakes out, it could be more or less than these amounts, and they can vary wildly in some cases. So let's talk about the most variable expense in surrogacy, which is health insurance. Now, many of you on this webinar, or will see this webinar later, are in the United States of America, and you understand how complicated our health insurance system is. It's not like most of Western Europe or Canada, where the government just covers health expenses. We have to all have some sort of health insurance, either provided by the US government, whether provided by our employers, or bought on an exchange at a very defined time of year, the Obamacare, if you've heard about that. And so that plays into surrogacy because you are responsible for the healthcare costs of your surrogate related to the pregnancy while she is pregnant, both during the pregnancy and also postpartum, 3 months, perhaps as much as 12 months in some cases, if there are complications. Not every surrogate has health insurance. Despite the government's best efforts, a lot of people don't have any health insurance, or they're on government-provided health insurance that's not acceptable for a surrogacy, or they have a plan, but their plan specifically excludes surrogacy as a use, which is something that some plans have. In the case in which they have health insurance and surrogacy is allowed on the health insurance, the cost can be closer to a $6,000 to $8,000 range, because what will happen is the birth of the child and the hospital costs will sort of max out what we call the out-of-pocket maximum that year, which tends to be in the $6,000 range for most health insurance plans, and sometimes you'll be responsible for the premium. So that's like the best case scenario. What tends to happen is that, in a lot of scenarios, the surrogate doesn't have health insurance, and so, or does as a surrogacy unfriendly plan, so we have to get her a new policy. If it's in the fourth quarter of the year, right around now, or the early part of next year, they can enroll in Obamacare and get a policy that will cost around $12,000 to $13,000 that will cover them that year and perhaps into the following year, depending on how long your process takes. That's kind of like the next best thing. If she doesn't have insurance, though, and it's not in those time periods, then we have to get a special type of plan that's usually underwritten by Lloyd's of London that can cost upwards of $30,000 and potentially more if things go a little bit longer than expected. So that's the variation in health insurance costs. So it's very important to understand what your surrogate's health insurance situation is, and even then it's just an estimate. This is one of the reasons why fixed price plans have taken off recently, is because there's so much variation in that cost that it's better sometimes to have a big company take on that risk rather than you, much in the same way health insurance works. So we could talk about health insurance and life insurance, which is another smaller piece of this all day. Just know it's a very variable cost. It's very surrogate dependent and even sometimes state dependent. Here in California, some health insurance companies will levy what's called a lien on your your surrogate and take another $30,000 to compensate the insurance company. So lots of complexity there. It's highly variable. Legal fees are a little more simple, but you need to pay for the legal fees. It's a very legally intensive process, whether it's the surrogate's attorney, you need an attorney, and then you have to use attorneys to also establish the parentage of your child in the state in which you live. And if you're international, there are actually attorney's fees on top of that to be able to establish residency and parentage in your home country. So it's pretty all over the place. Usually when you meet with a lawyer as part of the process in advance of starting it, they will give you like a fixed price sheet of various services, but even then court costs can be variable. So you'll have a decent sense of what this is going to cost you at the beginning, but court costs are unexpected and unknown if some places require a judge or not a judge to be involved. And so just know that there is some variability in the legal part of the expense stack. Travel expenses are also very much unknown. You're responsible for paying your surrogate's travel expenses. Not yours, by the way. I mean, you have to bear yours, but when agencies are quoting you prices, it's about like her expenses. She has to travel for her medical screening prior to the surrogacy, and then she has to travel for the transfer. Depending on where she lives relative to the clinic, it could be very small if she's just driving and needs to stay in a hotel overnight, or if she lives across the country from your clinic, then those costs can be a lot higher. Another cost that is something that a lot of parents get surprised about, and you should really ask your agency about this, is outside monitoring. So very simply, if you already have embryos, you work through IVF clinic, you guys are paying fees to the IVF clinic, and then you'll pay clinic fees for the transfer of the embryo, and that's arranged between you and your clinic. However, usually surrogates don't live driving distance to your clinic. And while they're undergoing their medication cycle, doctors want to do a check every week or so during those 3 weeks to make sure that the uterine lining is thickening in a way that looks good to them for a transfer. The surrogate will not fly out to the clinic 3 times for that. They'll generally get seen locally at a local IVF clinic, and they just go in for a basic ultrasound. However, it's expensive. Usually most IVF clinics charge $500 in the US for this. And so those will be costs, usually about $1,500 per cycle, maybe more if your doctor wants more ultrasounds. And so most, like you're like, oh, this should be covered by my clinic. It's not. It's not their clinic. They're not doing the work. They'll look at the results of the ultrasound, your doctor will, but you have to pay a local clinic to do that. That's part of the cost. Ask your agency how they treat that. The last and really big variable cost is lost wages. So during this process, you are responsible for paying for any time she or her partner have off from work. Usually the partner's involved in like the transfer, they'll come out for the transfer, and then they will also, of course, need to help the surrogate prior to birth and postpartum. And then if your surrogate works, she also needs to get compensated for any time off work, for any appointments, any transfers, and more consequentially, before and after birth. Where this can get very expensive is if your surrogate has to go on bed rest during the pregnancy. So that's why we see those like $10,000 numbers. I mean, the variability comes from, of course, what her job is and what her partner's job is, and there's variation there. And you'll have a good estimate of that, when you get your cost sheet from your agency. But then if she is going on bed rest, and let's say she works in retail or something like that, and she can't be at her work, you have to compensate her. If that bed rest comes out to 1, 2, 3 weeks, that can get very expensive. So they'll give you an estimate of what that is in advance, but you won't really know. Speaking personally, like our surrogate, like right after at the beginning of the pregnancy, heartbeat confirmation, she was spotting. She had to be on bed rest for a week according to the doctor. You have to pay for that, right? And so it's obviously you want her to do that. You want to succeed in your pregnancy, but that is part of the contractual terms of lost wages. So again, your agency will give you details on this. They'll look at her pay stubs to estimate this, but it will be your responsibility to cover these costs. Most agencies will do 3 weeks off of work postpartum for a vaginal birth, 6 weeks postpartum for a C-section. So when you add those up, average is about $40,000 on top of the money we discussed earlier. But keep in mind that the variability in these costs is very variable, right? It can really be low, can really be high. And it's the minimization of these variable costs as to why some people choose to go with the a la carte versus the fixed fee program. Because if you very carefully manage your journey and you're very patient, you can match with a surrogate that lives driving distance to your clinic, that has an approved health insurance plan that's not going to cost a lot of money, and is a homemaker, right? Like those three things can lead to you having very low variable costs, but it will usually take you a very long time to find a surrogate like that. So that is really the trade-off when it comes to these variable costs. So when you add those two together, you're talking about $140,000 on average. This all assumes that everything goes perfectly. This means that you match with a surrogate. She comes up for one medical screening. She's approved. The legal contract is uncomplicated. And then she goes for a transfer, successfully pregnant the first time, successful pregnancy, no complications, no bed rest, birth. What I described to you is likely half, less than half, of the journeys that we see. So just know that that is an estimate of variables, but we also have complications in most journeys. And so those numbers will be higher for your journey. So let's talk about the really fun topic, which are pregnancy complications. They're not, right? They're not easy. And the success rate of a first transfer is about 70 to 88%. And so that's with donor eggs, though. And a lot of you are not working with donor eggs. You're working with your own biological eggs. And those rates tend to go down the older you get, down into like the 50% range. And so just keep that in mind when anytime you're looking at success rates across agencies. You will likely need more embryo transfers if you're older and you have embryos created when you were over the age of 35. And then that's just like pregnancy rates, right? Then you have miscarriage rates. So yes, you're successfully pregnant, but one of the worst things that happens is that you're very excited about a heartbeat and then there is a miscarriage. Usually they happen before 10 weeks, but unfortunately as a larger agency, we've seen miscarriages because of all the cases we do, upwards of 20 weeks, halfway through a pregnancy, that are obviously way more devastating for everyone. And that will happen. And so the idea behind fixed fee programs is that fixed fee programs account for these things, whereas in pay-as-you-go programs, you'll actually have to pay additional amounts of money to the surrogate for travel, for everything else, when these things occur. And we'll kind of walk through those computations here in a second for various scenarios. But just remember that things can get complicated and they can cost more. So let's move on to the next slide and talk you through a couple scenarios. Again, there are multiple scenarios of ways in which this can unfold, but I'm going to talk about two really common complications. So one is just simply an additional transfer. So we talked about that like 70 to 80% like donor rate, and then 50% or so if you're using your own eggs and over the age of 35. So you'll likely need a second one, like odds are, or about half chance, right? If you have over 35. And then maybe like 1 in 4 chance if you're using donor eggs. But what does that cost? So there are 3 costs associated with this. One, you have that cycling allowance we talked about, right? The medications and the cycling. And then on top of that, we have monitoring. So if there's an additional cycle, they have to go to that clinic once every 3 weeks, right? Or once every week for 3 weeks to do the outside monitoring. And then you have the travel for her to go to the clinic for a couple of days, get her transfer, and fly back home or drive back home. This is just surrogacy costs only. Most of you with your clinics will have additional medical costs associated with the transfer, which generally are transfer fees paid to the clinic. They tend to average like $4,000 to $6,000. And then medications. Again, the doctor's prescribing the medications, the agency is not. So the doctor will write a prescription, you'll pay for them either directly or through the clinic, tend to average about $1,000. So add that on top of this, but the surrogacy costs themselves will be in the $4,000 to $7,000 range, most likely, for an additional transfer. Let's talk about a more difficult situation, which is a miscarriage. So a miscarriage has very similar costs to an additional transfer on the top section there, those 3, right? Allowance, monitoring, and travel, right? You have to do another transfer basically after a miscarriage. But on top of that, you also have to incur additional costs for 2 things. One, if you paid the surrogate any money, most agencies will give her a payment at first heartbeat, which happens at around like 6 weeks. And so when that surrogate's paid that money, that's hers. And whether or not she continues on the journey with you or not, she still gets to keep that money, and you have to top up her escrow account and her base compensation to ensure that she can get the full amount of compensation for another pregnancy. So that additional compensation will be required. But then there's additional costs too if you end up having to switch surrogates. So a miscarriage is not necessarily a disqualifying event for a surrogate, or it can be. It depends on the situation and what the doctor's evaluation is of this. Like, let's say you had 2 failed transfers and then you get pregnant and then you have a miscarriage. A lot of doctors will see that pattern and say, there's something wrong here. We should stop working with a surrogate. But usually if it's like an 8-week miscarriage and the first transfer, then we'll definitely try again, because it could just be luck of the draw. Miscarriages just happen sometimes for unexplained reasons. If it is like a 20-week miscarriage, having the pregnancy, a lot of doctors will say that's disqualifying. It just depends, and it depends on your doctor. If you have to switch surrogates, you will have to screen a new surrogate, which includes additional travel, but also you're going to have to incur additional legal expenses. You have to sign a whole new contract with a whole new surrogate. So there are additional costs if you have to switch surrogates. Some agencies will charge a rematch fee. Very carefully ask your agency, do you charge a rematch fee or not? Because if they do, you'll have to also incur an additional fee to the agency. We don't Hatch, but like some places do. So make sure you ask that very carefully, because those things do happen. You'll have to make sure you know about that. So those costs I just talked about, 15 to 20,000 for a miscarriage. And certainly if it's later on, if we're talking 20 weeks miscarriage, we could be seeing like $40,000 to $50,000, because you've already paid out more than half of the compensation to the surrogate. So these costs can be pretty great. The more difficult the situation is.
Yeah, and also just chime in there with the legal fees. Also ask your agency if they will cover those new legal fees with that new surrogate as well, because it is a big cost. Which rematching fees, like you said, kind of more uncommon, but to exist these days, but they do. But the legal contract, the new expenses for that is, I think, even more uncommon. So that's important to also ask.
That's a very good point, Gavin.
Yeah.
That's a big thing people don't think about.
Yeah.
So then,
yeah.
oh, sorry.
No,
I'm just saying, so now that we've gotten really down, really sad, let's talk about something a little less sad, which is other variable costs, right? So there are other expenses that can arise. They don't tend to be fixed. They tend to be pretty variable depending on, but some agencies will say like, these are the costs for these sorts of things. Depends on a myriad of factors. And it's important to understand that they can happen, because these are the things that my friends were really angry about when they got a bill for it, and they were like, wait, why do I have to pay for that? So let's talk about what a few of those things are and why you have to pay for them. So one thing is an experienced surrogate. To be very, very clear, I am not a doctor, but I will tell you that there is no difference in success rates between an experienced surrogate and a first-time surrogate. We use the exact same medical criteria to evaluate whether a surrogate who is applying to be a first-time surrogate and has had 4 pregnancies prior to that, and an experienced surrogate with 2 of her own pregnancies and 2 surrogacy pregnancies. When we're looking at both of them, same exact medical criteria, same exact success rates. The reason why people like to work with experienced surrogates who have done it before is because they know the ropes. They know what they're doing. They've been through it before. They understand the process, and that can be comforting to a lot of people who like that experience on the other side. If you have a good agency, of course, it shouldn't matter, but it is nice sometimes to have that comfort. So most surrogates at agencies will earn between $5,000 and $10,000 more for every successful previous journey. If you work with a 4-time previous surrogate, it will likely be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 more. Again, you should know this in advance of matching, but that is an additional cost you may incur if you want to work with an experienced surrogate. Other thing is that they want to carry twins for you. Twins are becoming decreasingly common in the US medical space. Nearly every single doctor has agreed that it's not worth the risk to either the surrogate's life or to your future child's life, children's life. There has been, again, not a doctor, but there has been a link to developmental disabilities and twin births in surrogacy pregnancies in recent papers. That's why the doctor profession has moved away from that. There are some doctors who will still do it. There are certain situations where the balance of risks that it makes sense for some couples to do that or parents to do that. But if the surrogate agrees to carry twins for you, they will get additional compensation, usually between like $7,500 and $12,000. This applies to not just planned twins, but also unplanned twins. Almost every surrogacy contract says if an embryo splits and everyone agrees that she's going to carry the second child to term, then you definitely owe her more compensation. So understand that risk. Now, there are provisions in the contract as well that if the parents don't want a second child and want to pay this, then there is the option for selective reduction. It's not very common, but that is also an option versus paying for this, the twins' compensation. If your surrogate is going to have a C-section, whether planned because she's had 2 previous C-sections or unplanned, you will owe additional compensation to her at birth. And that is usually spelled out in your contract, usually between $2,500 and $3,500. If for any reason she were to lose her reproductive organs as part of this journey, there's usually a stipulation in the contract that you have to pay her between $5,000 and $10,000, depending upon the contract. There are options to purchase insurance to cover this, and when you are matching with your surrogate, you'll be presented with those options so that that amount is paid by an insurance company and not by you out of pocket. But just make sure you ask about that when you're going through the legal part of the process. The final thing, just to kind of bring it up to happiness again, is a lot of surrogates are very happy to pump breast milk for your child, usually 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer. You'll negotiate that during the contract phase. They will get compensation for doing that on a weekly basis, tends to be between $300 and $500 weekly. And of course, you'll pay for like the shipping costs for her to ship that to you, especially if you're international. It costs a lot of money to ship internationally, but those will be costs that you can incur. Again, we can't force the surrogate to pump milk for you, and they may say 6 months, but their life situation needs them to stop at 2 months. That's just a risk you're willing to take or having to take. But that is a usual arrangement that happens in these surrogacies. A couple other things, if there has to be an invasive procedure, generally this refers to a termination. Again, termination is extremely rare in surrogacy because of all the genetic testing that's done. We're talking about less than 2% of situations, but if that has to happen, she will get compensation for that. And there are other invasive procedures as well, certain tests that can be done during the pregnancy that in many cases aren't necessary, but some parents want them. And so she'll be compensated for anything that requires any kind of invasiveness medically. And those are spelled out in the contract. And the last thing, and this is something that's more Edvin's expertise, in fact, maybe Edvin, you take this, which is newborn insurance, which really applies only to international intended parents.
Yeah, sure. So basically what newborn insurance is for us international folks that are pursuing this in the US, just like myself, which did that twice, we need to consider additional insurance. Just like Greg said at the beginning, like if the system seems complicated for US citizens, you can only imagine how it looks for us looking from the outside. So basically what the newborn insurance is aiming to do, which intended parents will ask me a lot, to put it simply, the worst case scenarios of your child is born, but there are situations where the child needs a lot of medical attention. Let's say neonatal intensive care, being in an incubator, things like of that nature is extremely expensive, especially under longer periods of time. So the newborn insurance aims to insure you for those costs, covering $1 million, $2 million, $5 million of those expenses. So what we do, for example, at Hatch, we have independent insurance experts we work with that present these plans to our international intended parents. They review them in detail with them, and they buy what they think is reasonable based on cost versus safety. That can range anywhere from 10 to 20,000. 10,000 is a more of a basic option of this insurance. 20,000 would be covering a lot more of potential costs, basically. So we'll help you find that insurance with our insurance experts, but no agency covers that in their fees, so to speak. So that's always an additional consideration. Awesome. All right. Summary, Greg.
Yeah, no, so add all those things up, right? And for those of you who don't understand the cost of surrogacy before coming to this webinar, these numbers are probably going to be very shocking to you, but it's not unheard of. The cost of this has just continued to increase in recent years with the inflation in the United States, but also just as many probably know, the scarcity of surrogates. We have wait times of averaging a year, if not higher, in the United States for surrogates right now because of the demand and supply imbalance. And so this cost is about $150,000 right now. If things go kind of as expected in the median of outcomes, and can really get upwards of 160 plus, depending upon how complicated your journey ends up becoming. And the fact of the matter is, it's like Murphy's Law, for those of you familiar with that US term, but like everything that can go wrong tends to go wrong for the same families. Unfortunately, it's like and it's not even the surrogates. They get a new surrogate and the same things tend to go wrong. So usually when it goes really wrong, and you end up incurring enormous amounts of costs. And hopefully you're not unlucky in that sense, but that really frames up the conversation around a la carte versus fixed fee, because fixed fee programs try to insure you against some of these more unfavorable outcomes. And I think when those unfavorable things do happen to folks at Hatch in our fixed fee program, they are very grateful that they are not paying significantly more than this. And that's what we see day in and day out.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just on a quick note on my kind of personal experience with that, the first journey around that, even though, I never knew half of this going into that, and that's kind of my fault initially, but even when you know all of this, it's still so hard to know exactly what's going to happen and what kind of costs you're going to incur. And just like you said, Greg, in my own scenario, we had, a new surrogate the first time around because transfers weren't working. The second one worked, miscarriage, and then the third one was actually the one carrying and actually having a delivery. So I think just like once again balancing towards how much risk averseness do we want in this journey and trying to kind of find that on a personal level, fixed fee or not fixed fee, that's up to you guys. But night and day in terms of experience, just know that the fixed fee in one agency is not identical in another agency. Ask what's included, what isn't included, even if it's fixed fee on both ends, because it's not identical just because it's fixed. All right, so just to spare some time, we have another 4 minutes though. Just like some of the pros and cons of doing this, I think it's kind of been expressed a bit throughout this part that Greg covered here. Obviously, potential lower cost initially with the pay-as-you-go model, not necessarily though, but it could be the case. Only covering your own expenses. So like Greg said, is an insurance policy more or less recovering in insurance, which you kind of insure not only yourself, but also others within that journey. Cons, I think those are very clear with less financial security. More costs are estimates only, which is harder to understand those variations that Greg kind of covered, and not protecting for those kind of worst case scenarios. And what could happen then, because we think about paying more, but actually the worst case scenario with that, the biggest con is that it could halt your journey altogether if you cannot, cover those additional fees. So what might sound like you will pay more and I have to deal with that, in the end, some intended parents, luckily enough, not myself included, but I had to take quite a long break during my first journey to kind of recuperate financially and emotionally, of course, but financially almost stopping my own journey. So this is really the biggest con and risk with having that kind of situation and solution, is that you might never be able to move forward, and all of that money so far invested and time is basically gone. Fixed fee, then obviously easier to understand the price structure. Once again, a fixed fee is not identical in all agencies. Ask and be detailed about that. Less worry about those variations, of course. Also easier to plan for. Usually there's a payments timeline, which is kind of taking this total fee and chopping it down in a couple of different payments, which helps to understand it. Could cover worst case scenarios, but once again, just because of the fixed fee doesn't mean that it will, but ask the agency. And just less stress and anxiety, which I think makes sense. No price deductions. If you look at the con side, like you're not going to get a discount just because your journey was smooth. I guess you can see that as a con then. Might still be variable cost, like Greg said, donor compensation, surrogate compensation, where she lives. Doesn't mean that everything is fixed, but usually most things are. And also other expenses. Remember that the agency usually, in kind of comparison to Hatch, does not have a clinic in-house, so they don't have like a fixed fee for agency and clinic, etc. So don't forget to look at the clinical side and don't assume that some things are covered for everything just because the agency covers it. For example, a lot of agencies like to say unlimited embryo transfers to live birth. But what does that mean if you're not a clinic? It means that you're going to pay the surrogate, like Greg said, cycling allowances, etc., unlimited, but they won't, cover the clinic's part. And sometimes intended parents assume these things, or with outside clinic monitoring, for example. So the devil is in the details. Read, and ask to understand what this actually means. Awesome. All right. So that was probably like a rushing train coming towards you when you see all these costs and all these different variations and variables. The point is that this is an initial kind of information point. If you do want to learn more about this, obviously you can have a chat with us and have a consultation with us and dig a little bit deeper. You can send an email to either me if you're international, or Greg if you're US based. If you're very technically advanced, you can use the QR code, but I never figured those out, but it's there. And also we have social media and all of these kind of events that you can kind of come to. We do webinars every month about different topics. Last time we had gay parenting through surrogacy, so that webinar is on that YouTube channel as well. So have a look out there and see if there's something that catches your eye, and feel free to join us again. All right, let's see if there's any questions. So far, I don't think we have any, but if there's anybody that seems inclined to ask something, please feel free to do so now. Anything regarding costs, obviously anything else that you would want to ask at this stage, very welcome to do so. Don't be shy. So see if somebody has anything. Until we just see if somebody pops something in. For you who are here, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. And there's going to be a recording sent out for you who are here, and also for you who weren't here live. I hope this was also useful. I know we are all at different stages of research probably, but hopefully there's something for everybody in there. I don't see any questions coming in, so hopefully that means that it is incredibly clear on our end. So Greg, thank you so much for joining in, and thank you all for joining us in this webinar, and stay safe out there, and hope to see you all soon, and best of luck on your journeys that you're going on.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.